Hello and welcome to AP Psychology. We are starting out today with the first video. This is Unit 1, Scientific Foundations, and today's video is going to be a very brief introduction to psychology. So let's get started. On the screen right now are your learning targets. These are taken directly from College Board. This is something that you will want to be familiar with to make sure that you are kind of checking all of the boxes that College Board says that you need to know before your exam in May. So I'm not going to read these out, but these are your learning targets. I would go ahead and hit pause, read over them, and make sure that you have a good understanding of all of these learning targets before the end of the video. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and grab your guided notes. These are notes that I have provided for you. We're going to start out with pre-scientific psychology. This is back before psychology was a science, before psychology was even a thing. It's pretty new science, all things considered, but for all of recorded history, humans have considered things to do with the mind, things to do with our consciousness, and so there was a foundation of psychology in the thinking of some of these philosophers that you see on your screen now. Their thoughts and their musings kind of led to this question: what is the relation of the mind to the body? And there were two ways of thinking of this. First, the mind and the body are completely connected. There is no separating one from the other. This was the belief of the Hebrews, Aristotle, and Augustine. And the other kind of way of thinking about this mind-body relationship was that the mind and body are distinct. They're different. They are separate. And this was believed by Socrates, Plato, and Descartes. So we're not going to talk a lot about this because, frankly, just knowing the names and kind of knowing this context is what you need to know for the exam for this course. And it's a little bit boring, so we're not going to spend a lot of time, but it is important to know kind of how things started in our field of psychology. These early thoughts kind of led to how, questions about how ideas are even formed. And so you see some familiar names again. Socrates and Plato believed that we are born with the ideas that we are going to be born with. They're already existing. We share them in common with other people. They're inborn. And Aristotle and John Locke believed that the mind is a blank slate, that we fill that slate with information from our environment, from things that happen to us. And so our ideas are molded or shaped by our experiences. A name to know, an important name to know in psychology is Dorothea Dix. She was an American, and she was widely known as the first advocate for people who suffer from mental illness, and she believed that they should be helped and not tortured. Really, before Dorothea Dix, people who had mental illnesses, they were put aside. A lot of the treatment that we imposed on people with mental illness was really torture. So historically, people with mental illness were believed to be possessed by demons, and they were given exorcisms, they were bled out, just very torturous treatments. She created the first mental asylum during the American Civil War. Up to this point, people were hidden away, and they did not get treatment that was beneficial or designed to help them. They were either punished because they were believed to be sinful, or they were believed to be possessed by demons. And so they were given exorcisms. It was believed to be a blood disease, so they were bled. Very primitive, painful, torturous treatment. So she was really the first one who advocated for people with mental illness. So now we move into psychology as a science. Structuralism is kind of how we started out. Wilhelm Wundt was our first main figure in psychology as a science. He came up with this idea of structuralism, and he is sometimes referred to as the father of psychology. He established the first formal psychological laboratory in Germany back in 1879. So when you think about it, this was after the Civil War. This is really pretty recent compared to some of the other sciences. And because he started that first lab, he is considered to be the father of psychology. His goal in structuralism was to study consciousness. And structuralism is focused on how the elements of the mind are organized, how they relate to one another, how the consciousness is built up and how it is structured. And he used this thing called introspection. And the way that I remember it is kind of an emphasis on that in. It is looking inward. It's considering one's own decisions and thinking. And this was how he studied consciousness, was through introspection. We move on to functionalism. This is William James. He is our first American psychologist. He criticized Wundt for his ideas being too narrow and, yes, too boring. That's an accurate way of criticizing Wundt. He was very heavily influenced by Darwin. I'm not going to go into, a lot about Darwin, but Darwin believed that we change based on our environment and we adapt to our environment. Well, William James was interested in understanding how our consciousness, think about things like thoughts, feelings, how those functions help people adapt to their environments. So that's the link between William James and functionalism. Another interesting tidbit about William James is that he wrote the first psychology textbook. He used introspection, but he also added in elements like questionnaires and mental tests. So he was similar to Wundt in some ways, but added in these other aspects. The next idea in psychology as a science is Gestalt Psychology, and that may be a familiar word to you. We're going to talk more about it when we get to the sensation and perception unit, but really Gestalt Psychology was kind of a revolution against Wundt and his ideas. And the Gestalt psychologists believe that consciousness is best understood in terms of the whole experience rather than trying to break it down into different elements like structuralism does. A catchphrase that will be very helpful in helping you remember what Gestalt psychology is the whole is greater or different than the sum of its parts. Max Wertheimer is a founder of Gestalt psychology, so that's an important name that you'll want to know. Okay, so the next person and the next idea that we get to in these schools of thought is psychoanalysis, and this is Sigmund Freud. You've likely heard of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is kind of like the spokesperson for psychology. He made a lot of contributions to psychology. First of all, he was the first person to focus on abnormal behavior. So he was really the first applied psychologist. He was the first to really apply it in a clinical sense. He believed that all behavior and mental processes are directed by unconscious forces. So our unconscious thoughts, dreams, feelings, fears, conflicts, all of those things that are not known to us but are still there. That was the basis of psychoanalysis. And so those are kind of your key terms here. Your buzzwords are unconscious forces, unconscious conflicts. He believed that problems arise from unresolved conflicts in the unconscious mind. So he believed that our experiences that all of us have that cause, conflicts or us to be traumatized or for us to be uncomfortable, you might call it baggage. The baggage that we carry around all the time, even if it's not in our conscious awareness, could lead to problems like mental illness if they're not addressed. He used free association and dream analysis to explore the unconscious mind because he believed that you couldn't really get to it directly, so you had to kind of go about it in different ways. His ideas really still are very controversial, but they have had a huge influence on the field of psychology. Like I said earlier, he was the first to focus on abnormal behavior. He was one of the first to really bring it into a clinic setting, and he is still the only one who really has a very thorough and complete theory about human development and behavior, much more so than any of the other theorists that we'll talk about. So let's go back to this idea of free association. This is where you say whatever comes to mind without censorship. So if I say the word yellow, something is going to come to your mind and you would say it, and that is free association. He believed that by analyzing the associations that we have, you can peek inside your unconsciousness. So moving right along on our timeline, the next big school of thought is behaviorism. And you see two folks here. This is B.F. Skinner and John Watson. Behaviorism was very popular from the 1920s through the 1960s. There are still some elements of behaviorism today. And the behaviorists really totally disagreed with everyone in the field. They had very distinct beliefs about how psychology should be done and what we should be focusing on. They believed that, and this comes straight from Watson, we should only study what could be observed and measured objectively. So whatever you can see on the outside, that is what we should be focusing on, not the inside, not introspection, not the unconscious, nothing that couldn't be measured directly. Skinner also insisted that solely external factors shape our behaviors, that there is a reason for everything that we do and it's all external. None of it's found, on these squishy inside internal beliefs and dreams and unconscious and whatnot. He believed that the thoughts and hidden parts of the mind are not relevant. It's not that he didn't think that they existed, it's just that they weren't important to him. All right, so up to this point, we're talking mostly about history and the historical perspective. So we move on to the contemporary psychology ideas. And today, our definition of psychology is the scientific study of behavior, so the things that we do that we can see on the outside, that we can measure directly, and mental processes. So it's the bringing together of those two kind of ideas of external and internal. Those mental processes, inner thoughts, feelings, rationalizations, memories, all of those things. But there is this huge controversy, this huge debate over whether human traits and behaviors are based on biology, our nature, the things that we're born with, or one's environment and experiences, nurture, our experiences from growing up, the culture that we live in. So this is one of the biggest debates, arguably of all time, but certainly in psychology, nature versus nurture. And when you boil it down, you're basically looking at whether it is genetic or if it is how we are raised. Another big approach that is contemporary is a biopsychosocial approach. And you are looking at lots of different factors kind of coming together in a funnel, so to speak. You've got biological influences, so these genetic predispositions, what's in our genes, what we can't yet change, including genetic mutations. You're talking about natural selection, adaptive physiology, and how those lead to behaviors, and how our genes respond to the environment. So biological, neuroscience, genetic. Then you've got psychological influences, learned fears and other learned expectations, our emotional responses, anything to do with cognitive processing, perceptual interpretations, the things that are happening in our brain that we can't directly see. And then a social cultural influence approach, the presence of others, people that we hang out with, our cultural influences, society as a whole, family expectations, our peer and other group influences. So not just who your friends are, but maybe where you work, how you're influenced there, how you're influenced differently between classes. Certainly who you are in one class may be different from who you are at a sports practice. So thinking about those social cultural influences and compelling models like our social media influences are big. So if you find yourself wandering off a little bit, come on back. This is important stuff. You will need to know the different perspectives so that you have a better understanding of how these ways of looking at behaviors and cognition and all of those things, how these different focuses influence treatment, research, all of those things that we're going to be talking about throughout the entire course. So starting out, the biological perspective or neuroscience. The focus here is understanding how the brain, how the body, how our genes create thoughts, emotions, memories. The question that we're always kind of in the back of our heads thinking about, how are messages transmitted throughout the body? How is blood chemistry linked with motives? All of those biologically based neuroscience questions. This is the focus of the biological perspective. Evolutionary, we will get to that definitely in the motivation and emotion section, but how does natural selection process, how does that cause behavior? How does that influence our genes to develop and adapt and mutate? And what causes specific behaviors to continue from one generation to the next? How does evolution influence our behavioral tendencies? Behavior genetics, you're going to see a lot of influence in the development unit, but how much do our genes and environment come together to influence individual differences? And the question for study is, to what extent does our genes, our environment impact personality, intelligence, mental disorders, preferences, all of those things that we think about when we're thinking about psychology. Psychodynamic. Okay, so think back to Sigmund Freud. Psychodynamic is the new psychoanalytic perspective. This is how newer psychologists have taken aspects of what they liked about Freud's ideas of psychoanalysis and have tweaked it to make sense for current day. There is an emphasis on the unconscious mind, and what the question is how do these unconscious thoughts motivate our action? Behavioral perspective asks the question, how do we learn to fear particular objects? How can we change problematic behaviors? The behavioral perspective is used very often when you're talking about phobias and treating phobias, as well as helping parents learn how to tweak their behavior so that their children's behaviors are a little bit more desirable. And their focus is how our behavior is shaped by the way that we learn. Cognitive, the focus is how we take in, store, and retrieve information, how we remember things, and how our perceptions of our environment influence our actions. So how do we use information to remember? How does interpretation impact behavior? And last but not least, you've got the humanistic perspective. I kind of think of these as kind of the hippies of psychology. Their emphasis is all about human growth, human potential, self-concept, self-achievement, actualization. So the humanists believe that there is good in everyone. They're much more kind of positive thinking than some of the other perspectives. They believe that people are really mostly good and trying to reach self-achievement. So when you think about self-concept, self-esteem, anything to do with bettering the self, it's probably rooted in the humanistic perspective. And lastly is the social cultural perspective. And they believe that human behavior has to be interpreted in the context of social and cultural influences. So their questions are going to be centered around ethnicities, sociocultural, demographical kind of information, how people are influenced by their environment. So your buzzwords here are social and culture. Okay, so when we get to the domain, these are kind of the areas that people pick to get degrees in when they are thinking about a career in some kind of a psychological field. And there are kind of two ways of thinking about it. First is a basic research psychology field. These are folks who are going to be doing research. Their focus is going to be on research to get knowledge, to get more knowledge in some areas so that other people can take what they have discovered and use it to improve people out in the world. They probably aren't going to be clinicians. So someone who is doing research in a biological psychology field are going to be looking at the connection between mind and body. They aren't necessarily going to use that information, but they're going to provide it for others so that they can use it in a more clinical application. You've got developmental researchers who study mental processes, behavior processes over lifespans. Cognitive psychologists study how we perceive, think, solve problems. Personality, you're looking at kind of longer term persistent traits, things that don't tend to change very much over a lifetime. Social psychologists explore ways that people influence one another and are influenced by other people. And then you've got psychometric psychologists, and these folks are concerned with looking at the theory and techniques of measurement. So anything to do with testing, anything to do with any kind of measurement. And then you've got applied psychologists. These are the folks who are taking the information from research, they are consuming it, they are looking at it deeply, they are studying it, and they are going out into the world and they are using that information to make things better for other people. This first psychologist field is industrial organization, and this is a newer field and it's really pretty interesting. These folks look at how behavior can be improved in the workplace, how people can improve their productivity, how companies can change the environment of their workplaces to make productivity better or to make processes more efficient. So this is a kind of up and coming field. You've got educational psychologists who have expertise in anything to do with teaching and learning. You've got counseling psychologists. These are people who are dealing with helping people cope with problems that kind of arise during our life. These are not generally considered longer term situations, but more things that kind of happen during your typical life. So it would be things like academic problems, work problems, marital challenges, divorce, sometimes grief, that type of thing. The next one is clinical, and this seems very similar to counseling. Clinical psychologists study, assess, and treat people with psychological disorders. So these are going to be individuals who work with people who have some type of a more persistent mental illness. So think of things like schizophrenia or pervasive depression or pervasive anxiety. So these are people who are working with individuals who could very well be struggling with these mental illnesses or psychological disorders across a lifetime. And then this last type of psychologist is a positive psychologist. And these folks look at positive events and how they influence our lives. Their emphasis is very positive and kind of a newer field as well. So when you're thinking about careers in psychology, you likely have to make a choice between whether you're going to go into clinical psychology or psychiatry. There are two main differences here. Let's start with clinical psychologists. These folks have a doctorate in psychology. They are a doctor level clinician, and they either usually have a PhD or what is called a PsyD. These are doctorate level degrees. They study, assess, and treat troubled people with psychotherapy. That's talk therapy, basically. So they've had a lot of years of experience and training in how to deal with these types of troubles. Psychiatrists, on the other hand, are medical professionals. They have a medical degree and they are able to prescribe medications, and they also can use psychotherapy, but they may not always do that. So these are folks who treat psychological diseases in their patients. There is often a little bit of a difference in how long people have to go to school. Again, the main difference here is a psychiatrist has a medical degree. Now, there is a field of master's level nurse practitioners in psychology that have a master's degree and can treat with medications, but they're not very prevalent, and it's rather difficult to find those folks. So let's talk about the American Psychological Association. This is a scientific and professional organization of psychologists. You're going to hear me talk a lot about the APA, or the American Psychological Association. It was founded back in 1892 at Clark University, and it is kind of our governing professional organization. They really set a lot of expectations for how psychologists act and what it means to be a psychologist. Some other folks that you need to remember before we wrap things up: you've got Mary Whitten Calkins. This is the first female president of the American Psychological Association. You've got G. Stanley Hall, the first president of the APA. He was also the first person to earn a PhD in psychology. So you've got psychologists before him, but he was the first one who really took psychology, majored in it, and received a PhD in psychology. And then you've got Margaret Floyd Washburn. She was the first female to earn a PhD in psychology. That's it for the introduction to psychology, and I will see you in our next video. Bye for now.